Hi everybody, welcome to BI Land. Nowadays we use variables extensively in Power BI and SSAS. We use them also to replace earlier function. The reason is that earlier can be difficult to understand and use. Yet I highly recommend you to watch my previous video where I go into the details of this function. Learning earlier is not just learning the function itself, it also helps deepen your DAX knowledge. Also bear in mind that there are still many companies using the older versions of SSIS where we can't use variables. In this video, we are going to replace earlier with variables in 4 examples. Stay with me and let's do it together. Okay, let's see our first example. In our table, we have different years, different countries, this is country code, and the oil projection. We want to see what is the prior highest record for a country, which means that if I filter on a country, let's say 24, Angola, for example, my production for the year 2020, I have this much oil production. I want to go look at all of the years before 2020 up until 1965 and see what was the highest oil production. So we need to iterate for different previous years and bring the maximum amount. For our first line, it is this amount, 1876. And for this year also it's the same. For 2018 also the same up until 2009, because in this range, when we are iterating from 2019 until 1965, we have this oil production and the maximum number is this, and this maximum number, it brings it here up until this year. In this year, then we iterate down from this year, and then we bring another maximum number, which is just the year before, and etc. And the same thing here, we see that there's a repetition here. So it means that 2004, I'm iterating to find out what was the previous highest record. I found that it was 2002. Because 2002 was bigger than 2003, I bring 2002 amount in front of 2004 and also in front of 2003. And that's basically what this function is doing. In this function we have used earlier. Basically we use earlier to go to outer row context and to be able to iterate over this filter function so that compare the current value of the line to the column of values and then bring the maximum oil production for those values. What we want to do now is to write this formula differently and use variables. How we can do that? Let's see. So basically here I am going to just copy this formula, Control C. I'm going to create a new column. And I'm only going to paste this and change the name to variable. We have seen these 4 examples in our previous video. I highly recommend you to watch it to understand exactly what's going on. In this video, we are using the same examples, but we are changing the earlier with variable. So here, let me go a few lines down. Basically, with the variables, we want to avoid earlier function. What earlier function is doing is that it takes the value of the outer context and compares it to this filter function. This is outer row context. The reason we were using earlier is to have one row compared to the column of values here. For example, earlier in the first line gives me 2020, and I compare 2020 to the rest of the years, and I bring the years before 2020. That was why we were using the earlier in this part. And also we were using the earlier to stay always in the same country, which means that the year in my current row context to be the same as previous, because we want to have the highest record for a certain country. That's why we were using earlier. So we have 2 earliers here. It means that I'm going to need 2 variables. And variables are always evaluated outside the function that we are having after our return key, which means that while I am here I have access to my outer row context, which is the row itself, and I can store a value and then iterate over a column which I introduce in my calculate function and use this stored value here. So here I'm going to define variable. Note that when we say stored value, it only means for each row. So in each row, you get first the value of that row and then you feed into the return. To use variable, I use this key var and then I put a name for it, and the name is going to be current year. And current year is going to be just our year column. Here I stored the year column in this variable, which means that when I'm in a certain row, it already, before entering into this formula, it evaluates the current year, which is year 2020, year 2019, and then it goes into this function. I'm going to create another variable, which is current country, and here is going to be the ISO number. And then I'm going to use return key and use my calculation. In each row, I am already having access to this outer context and then storing my value here before entering to my formula. And in my formula, what I want is the maximum oil production for years before the current year. And the current year, instead of earlier here, I can use my variable. So I want the maximum oil production, but I want to filter this table and I want to have only years smaller than current year. I replace earlier with the variable here, and in the second filter we are saying that we want to stay in the same country. We don't want to bring the highest record from another country. So here my ISO number is going to be the same as the current row, and I can use current country. If I hit enter, basically we are going to have the same number as this column. Enter. So we have exactly the same numbers. I'm just gonna make it 2 decimals. We have exactly the same values, and basically we replace earlier function with variables, because using variables, while we have access to our outer context, we store the value and then we proceed in our formula. So it enables us to replace earlier. In our second example, we are going to look at the ranking. Ranking was the ranking over the year, which means that we were ranking the country according to its production. So I'm going to choose a year. Here I take the filter out and select a year. For example, let's say 2010. I want to see the ranking of each country according to their production. I'm going to only copy this formula, which is with earlier, and try to make it with the variables. So a new column, paste, and here I'm going to add variable. Few lines down, I'm going to create variable. I have 2 earliers in my formula, so I'm going to create 2 variables. My first variable is going to be current production. Current production equal to oil production. And second variable is current year is equal to year. And then I'm going to use my return key for my formula. Here we are just saying that if the oil production is not empty, we are going to do our calculation. And basically ranking means counting rows where the oil production is bigger than the current row that we are looking at. And by doing that, we find the ranking of the current row. So we have filter over oil production column, and instead of using earlier here, I'm going to use variable, which is current production. Current production gives me the value of a certain line, and I want to count the number of countries that have oil production bigger than the current row's production. And also I want to stay in the same year. To stay in the same year, I'm going to use this time current year. This way we are replacing earlier with variables, because the variable before calculating this formula evaluates the value for the current row and then enters into this formula and compares the current row to the column of the rows. I hit enter. Basically we are going to have the same result as this column. So where we don't have oil production, it is going to be empty, and then we have the same number. For example, this country 860 is 47th in the ranking, and etc. In our third example, we calculated percentage of the total in a certain year. For example, in year 2010, we calculated percentage of certain oil production over the total oil production for that year. And again, we didn't need to do this in a calculated column or using earlier. We could just make a measure in our report, but this is only for the purpose of understanding earlier and also replacing it with the variables. So I'm going to copy this formula, escape, and create a new column. And I'm going to call this year. I'm going to add variable. So we have already a variable here, and actually we started this formula by making a variable of the total oil production in a certain year. Now I'm going to create another variable, which is basically the year. Current year is equal to year in our table. And this time, inside this variable, instead of using earlier function, I'm going to use the current year as the input. So current year, and I have already my return key. Basically, for each line, I have already the value for the year, which is 2010. And then I have another variable, calculates the production, but stays in the same year. For example, in this line, I am year 2010, and I want to put this 2010 against a column of the years and some oil production where the value is 2010. So it is going to be summing all of the oil production for all of the countries for this year, because in each row where the year is 2010, it is going to add up. So this is our total of 2010 over a certain year, and then we are going to calculate our production amount divided by total production for that year. So if I hit enter, I'm going to have the same number as here. We just need to make it percentage number format. So here we have both numbers. For example, for this country, it is 2% of the total production for the year 2010. In our last example, we wanted to know the next department study date for a certain country. So we are going to take the filter out of year, and we are going to select a country like 24. We see that like this line of data has been studied on this date, and the second line of the data on this date, and etc. So for each line, I want to know what is the next department study date. And we did this previously with earlier, which is here, next department study date. And now we are going to replace it with variables. So I'm going to copy this, escape, new column, Control V, and variable. I change the name. I'm going to Alt Enter. I have two earliers. I'm going to create variable for each one. My first variable, I want to know the current study date, which is department date study. And second variable, we want to stay in the same country, so it's going to be current country. And then return key. As we have already seen in our previous video, we want to know what is the next date. It means that I need to filter over the column of the date and choose the next date, because we have probably many dates that are bigger than the current date. We are going to choose the minimum among them. And that's why we are using here the minimum department study date. It's another context with the filter we are introducing. And here, instead of the earlier function, I'm going to use current study date, which allows me to have the value of the study date for each row and then compares to the values this column provide and finds all of the dates that are bigger than the current row and then takes the minimum among them. But I need to make sure to stay in the same country. For this, I had used earlier. Now I'm going to use the variable which is current country. If I hit enter, I'm going to have the same values as this one here. I'm going to make it short date. And basically, this means that for this line, the next study date after 9th April 2021, it's going to be 27th April 2021. And we can check this by just looking at here. We see that after 2021, 9th April, we have a date which is 27th. This was our fourth example. Okay, that's all I have for this video. Our goal was to replace earlier with variables, yet I highly recommend you watch my previous video to learn earlier fully. It will really help you enhance your DAX skills. Thanks for watching, hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. It helps me for the coming videos. Until then, take care. Bye bye.